my awesome pleasure to introduce Margarete Sandelkowski, who is the Carrie C. Boschmeyer Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill School of Nursing. She earned a PhD in American Studies from Case Western Reserve, an MS in maternal child nursing from Boston University, and an Ed.M. in nursing education from Teachers College, Columbia University, and the BSN from the University of Pennsylvania. She is director and principal faculty of the summer programs in qualitative research offered at the School of Nursing. She has published widely in nursing, interdisciplinary health, and social science anthologies and journals in the area of women's health, technology, gender, and qualitative and mixed methods. Most recently, she's working with a group of multiple PIs on a study entitled Mixed Method Synthesis of Research on Childhood Chronic Conditions and Family, which is directed towards integrating the findings of empirical research and addressing the intersections between family life and childhood chronic physical conditions. I am so pleased that Margaret is here with us today. Please welcome her to the podium.
Thank you all for coming, and I would like to thank the organizers of this wonderful conference for inviting me again. Thank you so much. I've tried to pick something that goes with the theme of this conference about looking back and then looking toward the future. And I've picked here we go. I've tried to pick something that has been an issue for a long time in qualitative research, something that's very familiar and resonant to qualitative researchers, but one that evokes a certain amount of controversy. So what I'd like to do is really provide you with a very fast primer on member checking and some of the debates about member checking and some of the things to think about if you decide to use this particular process. One of the things about member checking is that it has great appeal for qualitative researchers because it seems to capture some of the goals and desires of qualitative researchers for their research. For example, we talk a great deal about wanting to represent participants' voices faithfully, that we have them be enriched by the research process, that participants have a voice in what happens during the research process, and even that they become empowered by virtue of participating in the research that we conduct with them. And very much, when you look across the literature on member checking, the two big goals that people really have for it have to do with getting it right, meaning that when we produce findings that are scientifically valid or credible, and also doing right, meaning that we are promoting our ethical obligations for participants and protecting them in the research process. But the fact that we have those being right and doing right goals can sometimes be contradictory and conflicting. Really, member checking falls on the fault lines between those two kinds of goals, where the obligation to be right and do right are often contradictory. And some of the problems, some of the questions that member checking has generated include things like, when we show people something which they are presumably asked to verify or validate, what exactly are we showing them? Are they transcripts of interviews? Are they descriptive summaries? Are they our findings? And which of those things are participants really in a position to validate? And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Does a participant's refusal to validate a researcher's interpretation invalidate it from a scientific point of view? What is the right course of action should a participant decide that a researcher got it wrong? And there have certainly been situations where researchers have objected to the interpretations that researchers have put forward about their lives and experiences. And certainly many scholars have asked whether member checking is really about establishing validity at all, or is it in fact just another opportunity for generating more information, more data. So member checking is a very highly contested practice. For example, even though we say that participants are the experts regarding their own lives, they may not be able to authorize summaries and interpretations of data that encompass other people's lives. Oftentimes when... Pardon? Yes, yeah, fine.
It's not changing here.
Oh, they are changed here, but not up there. I'm sorry, hold on a second. Ah, I get it. I'm sorry, just a second. Yes, that's the one. And just okay. I'm sorry for the interruption. One of the things we say, just to backtrack, is that although we consider participants the experts on their own lives, are they really able to authorize what we show them? For example, there have been a number of situations I've encountered in my own work where people are shown, for example, a theoretical model or some sort of interpretation that's intended for a research audience, but people don't see themselves in that interpretation at all. And I remember very clearly a participant in one of my own studies who was a biologist, very familiar with reading science kinds of reports, who said when I showed her something, Margie, I don't understand this at all. The other thing is, so that people may not recognize, their own lives in the text, because the kinds of interpretations we offer to people include more than the lives of the persons who we're asking to verify those texts. Another question is whether participants are in a position to authorize or validate what they're shown. Again, this came through to me when a person, way back when, I showed transcripts to, and this particular participant said that she had never said what was on that particular transcript. So luckily, we did have an audio tape, and I just accepted that and said, I'll make a note of that. Went back and listened to the audio tape, and sure enough, it was right there. So that one can question, what was going on there. Certainly a person may have forgotten they said it. They may have been sorry that they said anything. When you talk to people later on, they're past the point of experience. At the time they told that particular story, they've moved on and are now in a different place. There's all sorts of reasons for why a person may not remember what they've said, but the point there is that even when you show someone a transcript, if you have an audio tape, one doesn't need to show someone a transcript if in fact you've proofed that audio tape against the transcript and there it is. So it's a nice example of how, depending upon what you're showing participants, they may not be in a position to authorize that particular thing. There's also the issue of that seeing transcripts that from a past encounter may in fact engender discomfort in participants. And it's very much like watching videos, for example, watching videos of childbirth, women in labor. There have been some studies that women can find that very disquieting to watch themselves at that moment in time. And certainly, some of us have all had experiences hearing ourselves for the first time on an audio tape, or seeing in black and white what one has said. There's something about putting something in black and white and reading what you've said that can be very disquieting. So for all of those reasons, one really needs to think about, well, what exactly are we showing? And is the person in a position to validate it? And is it, in fact, ethically appropriate to show them something that they may have said in a very distressed time when they were much closer to whatever the experience was that we are interviewing them over. In addition, participants, when they consent to come into research, they really want to please the researcher. They're there and most of the time want to be a good participant, if you will. And oftentimes participants may just validate something out of a desire not to offend the researchers, and oftentimes most participants will be completely uninterested in such an exercise. Now, the other problem with member checking is that, especially if we're doing something, member checking later on after an interview event at some distant point, we know that when people participate in open-ended interviews, they're likely to provide narrative accounts of their experiences. And we know that narratives are inherently revisionist things. People can change their minds about something right within the interview itself. And we've seen many examples of when you have an hour or an hour and a half interview and you're reading it over, that a person may give a certain account of something at the beginning of the interview, and in the process just of telling their experience that they come to some realization, because participants listen to themselves recounting something to you, something new occurs to them during that occasion, and that story can take on a different account or have different content or tone by the end, so that we know that things are being revised even in the same interview encounter. So, one of the things to consider here is that when we decide to do member checking in the service of whether it's validity or ethical obligation or both, that we really need to think about designing that member checking process, such as looking at what members do we even want to select for the procedure, what information do we want to obtain from them and by what means, what method of analysis are we going to use and how are we going to interpret that data, and also how are we going to use the findings of member checking procedures. Now, and some of that I'm going to go into with some suggestions about how exactly to think about those various aspects of designing member checking procedures. Another thing I want to mention is that depending upon the researcher's orientation or point of view or perspective, researchers articulate very different reasons for member checking. For example, member checking is defined both in scientific terms as necessary to produce a valid account of something, but also in ethical terms as participants' right and therefore researchers' duty to perform. In naturalist research, which is defined in part by a belief in the fact that there is a discoverable world out there, member checking as an instrument to optimize validity makes sense as a way to determine what that world is really like. And so it can be used as a way to test researchers' conclusions and judgment about the overall credibility of findings. For researchers in a more constructivist vein, where the idea of a world separate from participants or researchers is more debatable, member checking, in a sense, becomes very difficult to do in any objective sense, because in that orientation, both the findings are considered to be a product of both the researcher and participant interaction. So what is it that is really being checked on a member check? When researchers or research is operationalized in a collaborative or very critical modes of qualitative inquiry, such as critical ethnography, some forms of feminist and participatory inquiry, member checking is seen more as an ethical obligation to participants, without which those modes of inquiry wouldn't be collaborative or critical. So it's important to understand even the frame of mind or the orientation that your research project is being conducted in as to the slant, the tone of member checking, and what the real goal is of the member checking operation being used. And this divergence leads to a lot of confusion, this divergence between researchers about why they're doing member checking and the kinds of claims they're making for it. So for example, you may have researchers espousing feminist ideals, who may emphasize the importance of giving voice to the participants in their studies, yet their research findings and reports are complete voiceovers where what women say is interpreted, for example, in terms of masculine power and privilege. And there have been a number of reports where, for example, women participants have been very upset to have their experiences interpreted in terms of their not having their consciousness raised about masculine power and privilege, and that is not at all the way they would interpret their own experience. That is an example of that kind of thing. There have been some scholars, such as Gubrium and Holstein, back in 1997, who noted the irony of certain ethnomethodological approaches that were oriented toward debunking what members commonly understood about their behavior and their actions, which members may take issue with. Hammersley described, and this is an interesting article in 2013, where he did a critique of discourse analysis, and where he talked about how informants, when they consent to a project, may not be expecting what usually happens in discourse work, where attitudes, perspectives, and so on are not seen as an index of any particular form of reality, but rather that they're seen as instances of people's being taken in by dominant practices, being socialized into things that they are unconscious of. Those kinds of things can be very difficult if, in fact, members see those kinds of analyses, and oftentimes discourse work is something that researchers come to in projects that were originally conceived as more empirical analytical, meaning they're taking the data that they collect as actual indexes of real experiences, feelings, attitudes, behaviors, and then they become something else to the members' chagrin. They're reading an interpretation in which they're really not very much recognizing themselves, and in which what they're reading is really at odds with the way they see themselves and their experiences. Member checking is often used in conjunction with other practices that may contradict it. For example, when you read many research reports, member checking isn't the only operation used to optimize validity. It's often used with other things such as triangulation and peer review, and sometimes those things can be at odds with the member check. For example, you can have a peer review trump something, a peer review that is done with peers, in other words, other researchers or scholars looking over the findings that you've produced, may in fact trump the experiences or the interpretations that members would actually give to a particular experience. So one of the big problems, in addition to all of these sorts of confusions about what member checking is and some of the controversies it raises, means that we really need to do a better job if we wish to use the member checking process in designing what that process will look like. And that's what I really want to spend the rest of the time talking about, so that you can move away with some ideas for your own research about what are considerations if you are considering member checking. And certainly one of the first ones is, how do you balance out those twin goals of scientific credibility and ethical obligation, knowing that there may be times in which they conflict. So what I'm talking here about is, what should we consider in member checking? The who does the member checking? What is the member shown? The sampling, to whom is it shown? There, okay. At what time is it shown? Under what circumstances and for what purpose? And that's what I would like to go over with you at this time. What are questions concerning who? Well, should the person conducting the member check be the person who generated the information in the first place to be validated? Should it be the person who analyzed and interpreted the data? Or should it be some other person outside the study? And certainly it's a consideration we don't often think of, but it does address this issue of things like participants may be very reluctant to share what they think with someone who they have built a relationship, that researcher who's conducted the interviews, observations, who's spent time with them, and then come back and said, well, do you agree with what I have written about you or said about you? So it is a consideration in terms of whether you think this could be a major issue in the particular project that you have conducted. The questions concerning to whom has to do with the sampling issue. Oftentimes in research reports, people will talk about how they member check with a couple of people, but we don't know when you've had a sample of 20, 30, 40 people, how do you actually choose what the sampling design will be? Who will be selected? Will it have something to do with the findings that were attached to that person? Will it be some kind of a stratified sampling where you have decided that findings fall into certain thematic patterns and you're going to select people that represent one or more of those patterns? It is a consideration. Having a sample, let's say, of 20, 30, 40, and only grabbing 2 people probably is not very credible as a member check if what you're saying is you're doing it for scientific credibility to see if your findings have credibility to the members involved. So what kind of sampling should be conducted? And the idea that member checking should involve considerations of sampling. And this means that one has to think in the long term when you're consenting people that they know that you're asking that you might be contacting them in the future for some other contact, so that it's within the boundaries of your consent form already. But it's certainly a consideration. Questions concerning what? This is a big one. What should a participant be shown? For example, oftentimes a common thing that people are shown is a copy of a transcript. But as I've mentioned to you before, I would ask you to consider whether that is necessary at all. For example, most people who do interviews and create transcripts have audio tapes of those events. And please note that if you're doing audio taping, one should really keep the audio tape until you actually know that your transcript is a reasonable representation of the kind of data that you need and analysis you need, and to build that into the consent form. Because oftentimes when something gets transformed into a black and white document, you don't know how somebody said it, and you've forgotten, and it's important to go back to that audio tape because the sound recording can help you feel comfortable that you've gotten the right meaning from whatever it is that you have. So notice you have that audio tape, and one of the standards we have is that when we create transcripts, we're always proofing the transcript against that audio tape. I would suggest that a transcript isn't something that a participant is necessarily in a position to validate and would be just fatiguing, and for some of the reasons I mentioned before, participants may forget they've said something, be very upset seeing something again because they're in a better place now. For all of those reasons, I don't know that a transcript is the best thing to show anybody, and it's very tedious. Think about a 50, 60-page transcript that we often have from, a 1-hour interview, something like that. Is that really going to get you where you're going? And oftentimes, though, a transcript is what gets shown to people. This is a data near descriptive summary. And what I mean by that is that next level where you, as a researcher, creates a descriptive summary of what persons have said that is very close to the data. It's very low on the interpretation scale. It's basically a summary, data near, very low transformation of what the person has said, and you show that person, have I captured everything there, which may or may not be perfectly appropriate for the kind of thing that you are after. Are you going to show them a much more complex interpretation of their own experience? In other words, what they're seeing is not an interpretation that's embedded with everyone that was in your study, a total finding set, but rather you're giving an interpretation of that person's own experience. When you think about it, that potentially could be a little bit dicey. Again, what really needs to look at, what is it you're showing there? What are are the particular parameters of your study in terms of sensitivity, in terms of the type of participants in your study, your goals, something to think about? Or is it a full-blown, you have created the findings and you now wish to show your participants the total findings set from whatever analysis that you have done? Notice too that in most studies there isn't going to be just one analysis that you've done. One study will probably generate at least 2, 3, 4 reports, meaning each one of those reports is about a different analytic line that will generate their own set of findings. So that makes this issue even more complex than what you show. That means you'd almost have to go back for each analytic line if you want to do a credibility check with members and show them that interpretation. So again, it's something to think about. What is it you really want to show? And when a participant or a member gets something that is not just about themselves, such as a grounded theory that you've created, a phenomenological description that you've created, the person may not recognize themselves and their own experience in that larger interpretive set, and that may create some issues for you, that they don't really know what they're reading, can't identify, and so forth. And the issue is always, well, does that invalidate your interpretation? That's always the question there. Some more on the content. This has to do with that issue of empirical analytical versus sort of narrative discourse kinds of interpretations. And just to step out a little bit, there are, as you well know, there are many highly different analytic approaches that you can use with the very same data set. And oftentimes when we consent people to come into a study, the study is probably originally conceived as a study in which the data that gets generated, and here let's just for the sake of ease talk about interview data. That interview data is seen, treated, analyzed as an index of something actual about that participant. So when persons tell you they're angry or they had difficulty adjusting to their diagnosis of cancer, we say people had difficulty adjusting to the diagnosis with cancer. It's taken as an index of a real feeling, attitude, belief, behavior, action, you name it. And most qualitative research that you see published in the health sciences, and by far quantitative research done with human subjects, treats data as an index of actual experience. That's an important thing to understand. If you were to give someone a standardized inventory on depression, we take the responses people give to that closed-ended, structured format as an index of depression. There's a score. You're clinically depressed, you're not clinically depressed, if you receive my meaning. When you do narrative discourse kinds of work, the object of you do not treat data as an index of actual reality. You're doing something else with it. So that, for example, how the person presents themselves when they are talking about their reaction to cancer can be seen via a theoretical vehicle as an instance of impression management or identity construction. Do you see what I mean? You're going somewhere else. You are seeing something in totally different ways with different theoretical perspectives and not at all necessarily what the participants signed on for or consented to. And that's still a big ethical dilemma as to whether or not you need to go back, for example, to a human subjects committee if you wanted to do discourse work on a data set that you had collected for a different reason, but you now see a fruitful line of inquiry as to whether or not we need to go back to participants to do it. That's still up for grabs, and there's no hard and fast answer about whether that's right or not, but that's always an issue. And because qualitative research can theoretically be treated in any one of a number of ways that will not necessarily have been foreseen, that gets to be an issue. So I've given here an example. A person consenting to be interviewed over their experiences of being HIV positive will likely take that to mean that what they say will be taken as an indicator of their feelings, beliefs, etc., and not as an instance, for example, of how they manage deviance or present themselves. If you see what I mean, that might be very difficult for them to see, and it's not what they thought you were going to do with what they tell you. At what time? When should member checking be conducted? Most people think of member checking as a totally separate event throughout the project. So a project gets completed, there's some analysis done, and that's when the member checking gets done. But member checking can also be part of the project in and of itself at the time of data collection. And what I mean by that is there are some studies that perhaps there is only one encounter with each participant. There will be a one-time cross-sectional, that's it, encounter, one interview, for example. It is perfectly reasonable to assume that one can quote-unquote member check within that encounter. So, for example, when we do open-ended, minimally structured interviews with people, and you take the time to probe, clarify, summarize, let me make sure that I've understood what you meant. If there's something the person said that you didn't quite get, you say, you know, you mentioned X, Y, and Z. I'm not quite sure what you meant. Could you tell me? You are, in fact, member checking, and that may be it. So the member checking is embedded in just very good interviewing. You're really listening. You're following up. You at least have gotten comfortable that at that moment in time, you have gotten the actor's meaning, if you will, the member's meaning, and you've gotten things straight at that moment in time. And notice that offsets the issue of that you're talking to a person about something they said perhaps a month ago or maybe up to a year ago, and you know that those things, just on narrative theory, can be inherently revisionist. There's going to be perhaps a lot of change about how somebody thinks about a certain experience a year later. So right there in that member checking, you would at least have done that in the data collection event. Member checking most often is done as a separate event, at least that's what you see in research reports. But even here, one needs to think about, do you want to member check separately with each participant after they're done with the project, meaning that you go to each participant and show them perhaps some more transformed work that you've done on their data, its interpretation of their own experience. Each participant sees only something about themselves, and you do that member check later on, or do you want to do it after you've completed the entire study? You now have a total set of findings, and now you want to sample people on whatever basis to do that member checking afterwards, and those are kinds of considerations. Notice that in things like participatory action research, those critical theory kinds of studies where there are no lines drawn between researchers and subjects, there is no line, everybody is a co-participant in the process. These things are embedded in the process. In other words, in a way, it doesn't even make sense to talk about member checking, because in collaborative inquiry, people are collaborators. They're not researchers and subjects, if you will. Now, under what circumstances? I've already mentioned that there are types of studies where the text is treated as an index of experience versus the text itself as an object of analysis, such as in discourse work. It might be that there's something about the type of problem studied that may influence how you go about doing the member checking. There may be something about the types of populations, groups, or persons that are more or less amenable to member checking, like they may be hard to reach for a second research contact. Oftentimes, elite informants means informants who occupy a dominant or power position in the social order, such as the CEO of a company. They may be hard to reach or may be a little bit suspicious of what you're going to do, in which case one needs to do some other things there. But so it may be that member checking as a separate practice, not embedded in your data collection, may not be feasible because you won't get to see those participants again for any reason. Notice too that you may have some members that demand the right to edit any dissemination product you have or refuse its dissemination. And that can really have consequences, clearly, for researchers, because then you have a real ethical dilemma if a person tells you they don't want you to use their materials, their data, and that certainly has happened in the past. Questions concerning purpose. You know, this is an interesting one. What are you really doing the member checking for? Is it to ensure that participants recognize themselves in your interpretation? Is it that they agree to what you said? Is it that they consent to you putting those interpretations out in public? Or is it simply to allow participants to feel more involved in the study? I mean, those are interesting kinds of questions, and that we tend to vacillate between them. We're not really sure, that it's ambiguous about what we're really after. Is the purpose of member checking to ascertain whether researchers got the facts of the situation right? And here I'm using Maxwell's, he has a nice sort of paradigm, if you will, for looking at different kinds of validities that we're after. You know, in most research, we're interested in getting the facts of the case right. We're interested in getting the actor's meaning right. We want to understand what a person meant when they said something and not assume what they meant. And there's also this thing he calls theoretical validity, which refers to the researcher's findings, the researcher's interpretations. How do we assess that validity? So what is really the purpose of the member checking? Because if the member checking is about, if you want them to establish theoretical validity, meaning the researcher's interpretation is accurate, you can make an argument that members aren't in a position to validate a researcher finding, such as a grounded theory, for some of the reasons I mentioned before, that people are not accustomed necessarily to reading a theoretical model. If that theoretical model was intended for a different kind of audience, people may not recognize themselves in that. So the question is always raised, what is a member in a position to authorize or validate? Can they do it for you? And what does it mean if you're really asking sort of the wrong person to look at the wrong thing in terms of where you are at the end of that process? Now, there are risks of member checking to members. Now, notice that when people have said, when they've talked about the distinctive issues that pertain to qualitative research in the ethical domain, people have talked about the fact that the real risk for participants in qualitative research comes at the end of the study, not during the study, but it's when it's at that representation dissemination phase. And to take a phrase from the title of the book by Betrayal, when they read what we write, that's when the risk really happens, when people potentially are hurt or harmed when they actually see an interpretation we gave of their lives. And those kinds of, that particular anthology does address these issues of, speaking for others and what happens when people object to what those findings are. So there can be a real clash between, in Maxwell's terms, interpretive validity, which he defines as getting the actor's point of view, versus theoretical validity, which is the researcher's account that's in part based on the actor's point of view, but findings are based on much more than just the actor's point of view. So you can see there can be a real clash here when people are dissatisfied or even feel betrayed by the process. And I've already mentioned that sometimes the things that we do with participants in the interest of member checking may add an extra burden to people who are already burdened for whatever the experiences are that brought them into the study in the first place. And I've also mentioned the potential for harm when people are asked to look at transcripts of interviews that were given at great moments of anguish. And I'm thinking here too, just in my study, it was a very long one where we saw people over a 5-year period in infertility. That first interview was all about the struggle to have a child, et cetera, et cetera. Now they're down the road, have their child, and so they are being forced to look at something when they were really in a bad way, if you will. And we can think of many examples where we catch people at a despairing moment and then later on reintroduce that despairing moment because of what we show them to quote-unquote member checks. That's always an issue. And I've already mentioned the idea that people can feel betrayed, you know, that bait and switch thing. I consented to an empirical analytical analysis, that's what I think I consented to, but what I got was someone telling me that my consciousness hasn't been raised, or that some other interpretation, which may be entirely valid, given the theoretical perspective of the researcher, but is one that the member rejects. Risks of member checking to you as a researcher is the loss of data. It can be, it's very true, and those things have happened, that members may refuse, they may retract the data and say, I don't want you to use the data, in which case you really have a dilemma in terms of what to do, what your next steps are. And this can really be serious in terms of that your dissertation or whatever depends upon the data set that has now been revoked, if you will. So those kinds of issues. And they're still up for grabs as to how you handle those kinds of issues, whether they can be proactively handled and how one handles it at the time. There's also the risk of compromised knowledge development. If our sole goal, if the sole thing we want to do is to have all members agree with everything, it means that anything they disagree with has to be X'd out. And we can see that that can have real serious consequences for the scientific validity side of research. And again, you have that balance between scientific validity and ethical obligation. And there is a number of studies that looks at who owns the narrative in terms of research or literature that's written on human subjects, issues, and ethics, who owns the narrative, but which narrative is it that the participant owns and is in a position then to withdraw is always an issue. So, I've gone over, and I want to leave some time for you to ask some questions, because some of you may have some issues with some of the things I've said. But member checking does raise some scientific and ethical issues that go straight to the heart of qualitative research. It really depends on how you, the practitioner of research, see member checking, what your goals are for it, how you will execute it. And now it's even more complex before, given that we now do a lot of research online, where perhaps we never see participants at all. That's cyber research, virtual ethnography, virtual qualitative research. We have many more global, international, multicultural kinds of issues and research that come together, multidisciplinary. And we also, our qualitative research also straddles the line between having knowledge and social activist agendas. Many kinds of, for example, critical inquiry, their primary goal is some sort of social action for social change. It's an activist agenda as opposed to, quote unquote, a production of knowledge agenda. Those things can potentially clash. I would also ask, I always ask myself about, what would be the analog in quantitative research to member checking? And I can think of some things. For example, when quantitative researchers in instrument development do cognitive interviewing, and they ask people to comment on each item in a questionnaire in the service of establishing whether it is what the researcher had in mind, so what was in the participant's mind when they ask, when they answer a particular question, so we get closer to what the person had. But it's interesting to look at why do we qualitative researchers have this very strong urge for this thing called member checking, and do quantitative researchers also have this urge? Is there any sense in which they feel obliged to show their findings to members, and with the thing that, hey, members might not exactly like those details? So let me just end there so you have a chance to ask some questions.